Chapter 5. The Refusal. The Fantastic Four had said no. Reed Richards had delivered the refusal with regret, had explained at length the calculations that had led him to conclude that direct opposition to Magneto's regime was not strategically viable. The Fantastic Four were too visible, too easily targeted, too dependent on the infrastructure that Magneto controlled. Challenging him openly would mean destruction, not just for them but for everyone they were trying to protect. Sue had added her frustration, had argued that the Remnant was exactly the kind of movement that needed institutional support, that refusing to help was itself a choice to accept Magneto's world rather than fight for something different. Ben had said it with a grunt and a muttered curse. And Johnny had said nothing at all. Now, hours later, Ramai stood in the lobby of the Baxter building preparing to leave. The meeting was over. The no was delivered. He would take what he could get: a few contacts, limited resources, the beginning of a relationship that might someday become more, and move on. That was what the Remnant did. Adapted, adjusted, found other paths when the obvious path was blocked. He was halfway to the door when a voice stopped him. "LeBeau." Ramai turned. Johnny Storm was leaning against a pillar near the elevator bank, the same pillar he had been leaning against during the meeting, the same casual pose, the same expression of being only half present. But something in his eyes was different now. Sharper, more focused. "Mr. Storm." "Call me Johnny." He pushed off the pillar, walked toward Ramai. His steps were unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who had something to say and was taking his time saying it. "You got a minute?" Ramai glanced toward the elevator where Reed and Sue were disappearing, their conversation already continuing without Johnny. "I got a minute." "Walk with me." They ended up on the observation deck, the same space where the meeting had taken place, now empty, the city glittering beyond the windows. Johnny stood at the glass, looking out at the skyline. The lights of New York changed, controlled, Magneto's in every way that mattered. "You want to know why I asked about the infiltration?" Johnny said. "Not a question. That was the impression I got." "Smart." Johnny turned to face him. The casual mask was gone now, or rather it was still there, but something underneath it was showing through, something raw, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "I'm not stupid, LeBeau. I know what you're thinking. The Human Torch, the youngest, the loudest, the one who charges in without thinking. Why would anyone trust him with something that important?" "I'm not thinking anything." "You're thinking it," Johnny smiled, but it wasn't the performance smile. It was something more tired, more honest. "And you're right to think it. I've spent my whole career being a liability, reckless, selfish, too interested in parties and headlines to be taken seriously." He paused. "But that's not all I am. That's not even most of it." Ramai waited. He had learned in his years of building the Remnant that the most important thing you could do for someone was give them space to talk. People revealed themselves when they weren't being pushed. "The night Charles Xavier died," Johnny said, "I was at a party, stupid music, stupid people." His voice was flat, not emotional, just factual, the voice of someone who had made peace with a memory but had not forgotten its weight. The feeds came on, everyone saw it. Magneto's palace, Charles falling, the end of everything we thought we were fighting for. Ramai said nothing. "I watched it. I watched Charles die, and then I went back to the party." Johnny met his eyes. "That's who I was, LeBeau. That's who I am. The guy who watches the world change and goes back to what he was doing before it changed." "That was 3 years ago." "Yeah, 3 years of pretending it didn't happen. 3 years of being the Human Torch, the show, the spectacle, the guy who throws himself into danger without ever asking whether the danger is worth it." Johnny's jaw tightened. "I thought that was courage. Turns out it's just momentum. The habit of doing what you've always done without ever stopping to ask why." "Why are you telling me this?" Johnny was quiet for a moment. The city hummed below them, the sound of a world that had learned to accept Magneto's rule, that had found a way to live inside it without being crushed by it. "Because I want to join the Remnant," he said. "Not as a supporter, not as a sympathizer. I want to go in. I want to get close to Magneto. I want to do something that actually matters." Ramai studied him. The face was young, too young maybe, for the kind of weight Johnny was carrying. But the eyes were older. The eyes had seen something and could not unsee it. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of being the guy who watches." Johnny's voice cracked, just slightly, a fracture in the performance, a glimpse of what was underneath. "Because Charles died and I did nothing, and I've been carrying that night for 3 years and I can't carry it anymore. Because my sister writes letters no one answers and my brother-in-law runs equations that change nothing, and I can't keep pretending that the Fantastic Four is anything other than a museum." He stepped closer. His eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something that burned in a different way than the fire that made him the Human Torch. You said the Remnant is looking for someone who can get close to Magneto, someone who has the power to be a real threat if an opportunity presents itself. He held Remai's gaze. I have that power, and I have something else, something you didn't mention. What's that? Motivation. Johnny's voice was steady now, the steadiness of a decision made, a line crossed, a door opened that could never be closed again. I know what I'm fighting for, I know what I'm willing to lose, and I know that some things are more important than living. Remai was quiet for a long time. The city glittered. The night pressed against the windows. Somewhere below, the enforcers patrolled, and the world continued as it had continued for 3 years, ordered, controlled Magnetos. The work's dangerous, he said finally. The infiltration could take months, maybe years. And even if you get close, even if the opportunity comes, there is no guarantee you'll survive it. I know. And if you fail, if they catch you, or kill you, or worse, nobody'll know you were anything more than what you appear to be. The Human Torch who sold out. The sellout who got what was coming. I know, Johnny's voice was quiet, certain. That's the point, isn't it? The story that looks wrong is more powerful than the truth. When they find out the Human Torch was a remnant all along, when they realize I wasn't a sellout but a sacrifice, that's when it matters. That's when the story changes things. Ramai looked at him. This young man who had just offered him everything, his skills, his power, his willingness to die, and who had done it not with the recklessness that defined his public persona, but with the deliberate calm of someone who had thought it through and made a choice. He thought of Charles Xavier, who had believed in saving people. He thought of Magneto, who had believed in forcing them to be saved. He thought of the remnant, the ember, the patience, the story that spread quietly through example. You're not what I expected, Ramai said. Johnny smiled. It was the first genuine smile Ramai had seen on his face, not the performance, not the mask, but something real, something that looked like it had been hiding for a long time. I'm not what I expected either, he said. Turns out that's the only way to surprise people. Ramai briefed him that night, in a safe house in what used to be Queens. The documents were spread across the table, identity papers, contact schedules, entry codes. The remnant had done its work. The infiltration was as ready as it could be. You go in as yourself, Ramai explained. The Fantastic Four's golden boy. You make contact with Magneto's people, say you're interested in, let's call it prestige placement. A mutant who commands one of the most powerful superhero teams on Earth wants to work with Magneto instead of against him. That's a story people want to believe. Because they won't think I'm a spy. They'll think you're a sellout. And a sellout is the last thing anyone suspects is a spy. Johnny studied the documents, memorized the protocols, asked the questions that needed to be asked. What's the end game? Information at first. You get close to Magneto's inner circle, you report back what you find. If an opportunity presents itself, a weakness, a target, a moment where he's vulnerable, you take it. And if the opportunity never presents itself? Ramai was quiet. The question was the same one he had been asking himself for 5 years, the question that defined the Remnant's philosophy, the reason they waited instead of fought. Then we wait, he said. That's what the Remnant does. We wait, we watch, we remember. The opportunity always comes eventually. Johnny nodded slowly. He picked up the last document, the contact schedule, the list of names and faces who would become, over the next 9 months, his colleagues, his targets, his mask. What if I don't want to wait? The question hung in the air. Ramai met his eyes and saw something there that he had seen before, in the faces of people who joined the Remnant not because they wanted to survive, but because they wanted to matter. The look of someone who had decided, consciously, that some things were worth dying for. Then you better know what you're burning for, Ramai said quietly. Because once you start, once you decide the time is now instead of later, there is no going back. Johnny looked at the documents, then at Ramai, then at the window where the city lights glittered like a field of distant fires. I know what I'm burning for, he said. I've known it since the night I went back to the party. I've just been too scared to let it catch. He set down the documents, stood, extended his hand. When do I start? Ramai took his hand and shook it. Tomorrow, he said, you start tomorrow. Chapter 6, The Performance 9 months into the infiltration. Johnny Storm discovered that wearing a mask was easier than he expected. Not a literal mask, though he had worn those too in the early days, when he was still learning the contours of the character he was playing. The mask he wore now was subtler. It was the expression he put on every morning when he woke up in the apartment Magneto's administration had assigned him. It was the tone of voice he used when he spoke to Maris, to the other mutants in his unit, to the enforcers who nodded at him in the corridors of the palace. It was the way he laughed at jokes that weren't funny, nodded at observations he disagreed with, performed the role of a man who had given up on everything and found peace in the giving up. The performance was perfect, that was the problem. He had spent his whole life performing, playing the Human Torch, playing the charming delinquent, playing the youngest member of the Fantastic Four who couldn't be taken seriously because he didn't take himself seriously. The difference now was that the performance had no off switch. He woke up wearing the mask, and he wore it through every hour of every day, and when he finally fell asleep at night, the mask was still there, not on his face but underneath it, seeping into the spaces between who he was and who he was pretending to be. Ramai checked in once a week, through dead drops that Johnny never failed to visit. The intelligence reports grew longer as the months passed, patrol schedules, security vulnerabilities, the names and faces of mutants who were close to Magneto and therefore worth knowing. The Remnant was building a picture, and Johnny was the lens. But the reports were not the reason he stayed. He stayed because the mask was easier than the alternative. The alternative was remembering. The memory came unbidden, in the quiet moments when the performance faltered and the real Johnny surfaced, blinking, confused, unsure how he had arrived at this particular moment in this particular life. New York, 3 years ago. The party with the stupid music and the stupid people, the woman whose name he never learned, the feeds cutting in with the news about Charles Xavier. He remembered watching the footage, the Genoshan Palace, the fall, the body on the flagstones, and feeling nothing. Not horror, not grief, not the outrage that should have consumed him. Just recognition. The acknowledgement that something had ended, that the world had changed, and that he was standing in a room full of people who would never understand what had just happened. And then he had gone back to the party. That was the moment, the defining moment, the moment when Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, the hero, the man who had thrown himself into 1,000 dangers without ever once asking whether the dangers were worth throwing himself into, had learned what he was really made of. Cowardice, the kind that wore a charming face and never knew its own name. He had carried the memory for 3 years, turning it over in his mind like a card he couldn't put down. It had shaped every decision he made after that night, every fight he threw himself into, every cause he pretended to care about, every time someone told him he was brave and he wanted to scream because he knew, that bravery was not the same as recklessness, and he had been mistaking one for the other for his entire career. Now he was here, playing a sellout, pretending to be the thing he had never been. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his apartment in the Genoshan capital, was that the performance felt true. Not because he was actually a sellout, but because the anger underneath it was real. The disappointment. The exhaustion with a world that had decided to accept Magneto's rule and call it peace. He was not a sellout, but he understood sellouts. He understood the logic of giving up, the relief of it, the simplicity, the way it made everything else stop mattering. That was what made the performance convincing. He wasn't pretending to feel something he didn't feel. He was showing them the truth of what giving up felt like and letting them draw their own conclusions. The other mutants in his unit treated him with a kind of careful respect, the respect you give to someone who has power and might not know how to use it wisely. They were all, in their way, the product of Magneto's world, mutants who had grown up knowing that the world was divided into those who had power and those who served it. They had learned to navigate the hierarchy, to find their place within it, to make peace with the fact that peace had been purchased at the cost of freedom. Johnny did not fit the pattern. He was too young, too famous, too obviously from a different world. They watched him with curiosity and suspicion, waiting for him to reveal something that would explain why he had chosen to be here, why he had abandoned the Fantastic Four for a position in Magneto's court. He gave them nothing, the mask held. But sometimes in the evenings, when the work was done, and the unit gathered in the common room to drink and talk and pretend that everything was normal, Johnny found himself listening to their stories, the quiet frustrations, the small resentments, the accumulated weight of a life lived within limits that had been set by someone else. They were not monsters. That was the thing he had not expected. They were not true believers or zealots or any of the easy categories that would have made his job simpler. They were just people who had accepted the world as it was because the alternative was too hard, too dangerous, too likely to end in the kind of disappearance that Magneto's enforcers were so good at arranging. One of them, a mutant named Dara who could manipulate sound in small ways, told him, late one night, about the life she had lived before Magneto's ascension. She had been a musician, had played in orchestras and studios in the kind of venues where the audience came to be moved and left having been moved. When Magneto took power, the orchestras disbanded, the studios closed, the venues were converted to other purposes. Music was not a priority in the new world. People needed to work, to contribute, to serve the greater good in ways that could be measured and evaluated. "Now I work in security," Dara said. Her voice was flat, not bitter, just factual. "I check credentials at checkpoints. I make sure the right people get through and the wrong people don't. It's not what I wanted, but it's what there is." Johnny listened. He did not say anything. The mask didn't allow for that kind of connection, but he listened, and he filed the story away, and he added it to the growing catalog of evidence that Magneto's world was not a tyranny imposed from above, but a resignation accepted from below. That was what made it work. That was what made it so hard to fight. The people who lived under Magneto's rule were not victims, not in the way victims usually were. They had chosen this, had accepted it, had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that safety was worth more than freedom, and that a world with boundaries was better than a world without them. Johnny understood the choice. He did not agree with it, but he understood it. That was why he was here. Not to judge them, not to save them, but to do the thing that no one else was willing to do, to show them that another choice was possible. Even if showing them meant burning himself to nothing in the process. Chapter 7. The burning the opportunity came not as a gift, but as a schedule. Magneto was addressing the full council and the senior enforcer corps in the central arena. Public address. Broadcast across the domain. Thousands of eyes watching, including the eyes of every resistance cell that had learned to access Magneto's feed and watch without being seen. Johnny was in the third row. He had been placed there deliberately. Maris had arranged it, had used his influence to ensure that Johnny had a seat close enough to see Magneto's face, to watch the lines that had deepened over 3 years of rule, to see the tremor in his left hand that Magneto tried to hide and failed. The tremor was new, or rather the tremor was old, but Johnny had only just noticed it. It appeared when Magneto raised his hand to emphasize a point, disappeared when the hand was still, came back when the gesture demanded it. The mark of something failing, the sign of a body that was holding together through will alone. Magneto was dying. Not quickly, not in any way that was visible to most observers, but the signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. The lines, the tremor, the way he held himself, not with the strength of a man who ruled the world, but with the careful balance of a man who was not sure how much longer he could stand. Johnny had known going in that there might never be a right moment, that the opportunity Ramai had described, the weakness, the target, the moment when Magneto was vulnerable, might never come. And he had known even then that he was not willing to wait for it. Waiting was for people who believed the future would be different from the present. Johnny had stopped believing that a long time ago. The speech was about legacy, about continuity, about the world that Magneto was building and the generations that would inherit it. The words were measured, deliberate, the rhetoric of a man who had spent decades learning how to make words carry weight. Johnny listened to the words and watched the hands and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the moment was now. Not because it was strategic, not because it was the smart play, because it was the only play he had, and he had been pretending to be a sellout long enough, and the mask was heavy and the fire was waiting. He stood. His body ignited. The fire came from somewhere deeper than muscle memory. It came from the place where Johnny had kept it for 26 years. The solar energy absorbed through his skin, the power that had made him what he was, the thing he had learned to control and contain and deploy in careful, measured doses, and which he now deployed in a single, catastrophic release. The arena became a sun. Heat and light and force erupted outward, and every person in that room felt the temperature spike 100 degrees in an instant. The seats buckled. The air ignited. The sound was not an explosion but a roar, the roar of a man who had spent 9 months pretending to be nothing and was finally everything. Johnny flew at Magneto. The impact was the single most powerful attack the Human Torch had ever delivered. He was not a precision weapon. He was an explosion, and he exploded directly into Magneto's chest with everything he had, everything he was, everything he had never said to his sister or his brother-in-law or his best friend. Magneto raised his hands. Magnetic fields erupted around him, metal screaming, the air itself fighting to create a path for his defenses. But Johnny was faster, hotter, more desperate. The first strike hit the left side. Shoulder, arm, the vulnerable flesh where the magnetic fields couldn't fully protect. The second, third, fourth, all landing on the same side, hammering the same point, the fire spreading across Magneto's face, his neck, the left side of his body where the burns went deepest. Magneto screamed. The sound was not pain, or not only pain. It was violation. The fire was on him, inside him, and magnetic fields could stop metal, but they could not stop plasma, could not stop light, could not stop the sheer thermal weight of a man who had decided to die and take his enemy with him. The arena collapsed, partially. The structure buckled, the supports weakening, the crowd fleeing in every direction. The enforcers charged, weapons charging, but the air was fire and no one could get close. Johnny kept burning. He didn't stop when Magneto raised his hands. He didn't stop when the ceiling beams began to melt. He didn't stop when the suppression systems activated, electromagnetic foam flooding the room, designed to smother energy attacks. He burned through the foam, burned through the air, burned through every defense. This was what he had been made for. The light was blinding, the heat was absolute. And then quietly, almost gently, the fire went out. Johnny Storm collapsed on the stage. His body was a ruin of burned tissue and depleted energy. The solar energy that had defined him was gone, consumed in a single act that meant everything and nothing. Magneto stood over him, burned on his left side, his face a mask of scarred flesh in disbelief. "Torch," Magneto said. His voice was a rasp. "You tried to burn me." Johnny laughed. It cost him something: pain, energy, the last reserves of whatever kept a body going. But he laughed because laughing was the only answer he had. "I just wanted to see if you could burn." "Who sent you?" "No one, bastard." The last thing Johnny saw was Magneto turning away. "Take him away." Chapter 8. The cost. 3 days later, Johnny Storm died in a remnant safe house. Extraction had been chaos. Ramai had mobilized every contact in Genosha, pulled every string, called in every favor to get Johnny out of the arena before the enforcers could determine whether he was alive or dead. The answer had been yes and no. Alive, but barely, and the thing that had made him the Human Torch was gone. Burned away. Spent in a single supernova that had scarred Magneto forever and accomplished nothing except the one thing Johnny had wanted to accomplish. "I just wanted him to remember." Ramai sat with him in the final hours. They had not been close, a few conversations, a handful of briefings, the professional relationship of a spy and his handler. But Ramai understood what Johnny had done and what it cost, and that understanding was its own kind of intimacy. "Did we get him?" Johnny asked. His voice was thin, ravaged by the heat that had consumed him from the inside. "He survived." Ramai paused. He owed him the truth. "The burn-in's permanent. Left side of his face, they don't know if it'll heal. His arm, his shoulder. He lost vision in one eye." Johnny smiled. It was not the performance smile, not the charm, not the mask. It was something realer, sadder, more honest. "Good, I wanted him to remember." Ramai chuckled. "And the people watching, the whole world. They watched. They saw you walk into that room and burn yourself to nothing just to hurt him. They saw it, Johnny." The smile faded, not into sadness, into something more complex, something that Ramai couldn't quite name. "They's gonna think you're a traitor, to the end." "They's wrong." "Doesn't matter." Johnny's voice was barely audible now. The end was coming and he knew it, and he was using the last of his strength to say something that mattered. "Let them think what they want to think. Let them think I was just another burnt-out hero who couldn't handle the new world. That's fine. That's actually perfect." He paused. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just heavy. "Then when the time comes, when your time comes, and they find out the Human Torch was a remnant all along, that story matters more than the truth does. The truth is just facts. The story is what people believe. And what people believe is what changes the world." Ramai had built the remnant on patience, on the ember that caught eventually, on the idea that the story that mattered was the one that spread quietly, through example, through the slow accumulation of people who remembered that another way was possible. Johnny's philosophy was different, sharper. The idea that a story told wrong could be more powerful than a truth told right. "Where'd you learn that?" "I learned it from you," Johnny said. "From the remnant. From the whole idea of it, build something that lasts, not something that wins. I just applied it to myself." The rain had stopped outside. The clouds were parting. Ramai could hear the sound of the city waking up, enforcer patrols, morning traffic, the ordinary sounds of a world that belonged to Magneto and did not know what had happened in the arena 3 days ago. Johnny died as the sun rose. Ramai stayed until the body was cold, then contacted the medical liaison and arranged for a quiet cremation. He scattered the ashes himself, in a park where the city skyline was visible. The ashes dispersed in the wind, not dramatically, not spectacularly, just gone. "You were a good man, Johnny Storm," Ramai said to no one. "You just didn't know it yet." He walked home. The ember was still burning. It would catch eventually. It always did. Chapter 9. The news spread like all news spread in Magneto's world, quickly, completely, and in exactly the direction the regime wanted it to go. The Human Torch had attacked Magneto, had gone supernova in the middle of a public address, had burned down half the arena before being stopped, had died of his injuries 3 days later. The story the world received was simple. The Human Torch had been a sellout, had joined Magneto's court and then, for reasons no one would ever understand, had turned on him, had attacked him and lost, had died as a traitor, a cautionary tale about the dangers of cynicism and the foolishness of thinking you could play both sides. Fantastic Four issued no statement. There was nothing to say, nothing that wouldn't make things worse, nothing that wouldn't draw attention to the fact that Johnny had been gone for 9 months and they hadn't known where he was or what he was doing. Reed said nothing. Sue said nothing. Ben Grimm said his usual grunt, and the media moved on to the next story, and the world forgot that the Human Torch had ever been anything other than what he appeared to be. But in the Remnant, the story was different. Ramai gathered the senior cell leaders in a safe house in what used to be Berlin. Kurt Wagner was there. So were a dozen others, the people who had built the network over 5 years of patient work, who understood what it cost to resist, who knew that every sacrifice mattered even when the world didn't see it. "He was one of us," Ramai said. He stood at the front of the room, his voice quiet but carrying, the way it always carried when something important needed to be said. "The Human Torch. He joined us 9 months ago, came to me after the meeting with the Fantastic Four, said he wanted in, said he wanted to do something that actually mattered. I believed him. I put him in." The room was silent. They had all heard the news. They had all wondered. "I put him in and I sent him to infiltrate Magneto's court and I told him to wait for the right moment. But Johnny didn't wait." Ramai paused. The words were harder than he expected, harder even than he had practiced. He saw an opportunity. He took it. He burned himself to nothing just to leave a scar on Magneto's face that'll never heal. Kurt spoke first. His voice was quiet, thoughtful, the voice of a man who had spent his life thinking about things that mattered. He knew the world would remember him as a traitor. "Yeah," Ramai nodded slowly. "He knew. He told me near the end, he told me, that the story that looked wrong was more powerful than the truth. That when the time came and they found out who he really was, that was when it would matter. That was when the story would change things." The room was silent again. Ramai looked at the faces around him, the faces of people who had joined the Remnant for different reasons, who believed in different things, who had found their way to the same ember through different paths. He saw understanding in their eyes. He saw the recognition of something that transcended individual sacrifice. "Johnny Storm wasn't a sellout," he said. "He was a remnant, he always was. And now he's gone, but the scar he left on Magneto's face, that's still Dara. That's always gonna be Dara. And someday when the time is right, when the story can be told the way it actually happened, that scar's gonna mean something. It's gonna stand for everything we believe in, everything we've been building, every ember we've been keeping alive." He paused. The room held its breath. "Johnny Storm burned for us. He burned for the idea of it, and that's not gonna be forgotten, not by us, not ever." The silence stretched and then, slowly, it became something else. Not comfort, exactly. Not closure. But something that held the shape of both, something that could carry the weight of loss while still pointing toward what came next. Kurt stood. He walked to Ramai, extended his hand. Ramai took it. "He was a good man," Kurt said quietly. "Yeah," Ramai's voice was rough. "Yeah, he was." The meeting ended. The cell leaders dispersed, back to their territories, their cells, their quiet work of building something that would last. Ramai stayed in the safe house for a long time, alone, thinking about the people who had burned for the Remnant and the people who would burn for it still. He thought about Johnny Storm, the party, the feeds, the night everything changed. The 9 months of wearing a mask. The moment in the arena when the mask came off and the fire came out, and a man who had spent his whole life being underestimated finally became something that could not be underestimated. He thought about the scar on Magneto's face, the permanent mark, the thing that would never heal. And he thought about the ember, the quiet, patient fire that the Remnant had been building for 5 years, that would catch eventually, that would burn eventually, that would change the world eventually even if the world didn't know it yet. Ramai stood, walked to the window, looked out at the city, the streets, the buildings, the lives being lived inside them, the people who had accepted Magneto's world and called it peace. Someday, he thought, someday they would remember that another way was possible. Someday the ember would catch. And when it did, the scar on Magneto's face would mean everything. Chapter 10: Faith. Kurt Wagner had been many things in his life. He had been a circus performer, a boy with a tail and blue skin who learned to turn his differences into something beautiful, who learned that the eyes that looked at you with fear could be made to look with wonder if you were willing to do the work. He had been a Catholic boy, had believed in God with the uncomplicated faith of a child, had prayed every night for the salvation of his soul, had trusted that the goodness he tried to cultivate in himself would be enough to carry him through whatever the world decided to throw at him. He had been an X-Man, had fought beside Charles Xavier, had learned from him, had let himself believe, truly believe in the deepest part of himself, that the dream was possible, that mutants and humans could coexist. That understanding was achievable, that the fear that had defined mutant existence for generations could be overcome through patience, through example, through the slow accumulation of evidence that we were not so different after all. He had been a priest briefly, before the priesthood proved too small for the questions he was asking. He had been a pirate. That story was long and involved a dimension that should not exist and a version of himself that was not quite him. He had been many things, and all of them had left marks on him, and all of the marks had led him here, to this moment, this room, this choice. He knelt in the small chapel he had built in the outer district of the city, not a real church, not officially, but a space he had claimed and sanctified and filled with the things that mattered to him. A crucifix on the wall, candles that burned without end. Smell of incense that he had used since he was a boy, since the circus, since the first time he had learned that certain smells could carry you somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere the fears of the world could not reach. Kurt had been working for Magneto's intelligence network since the early days of the new regime. He had not been recruited through coercion or bribery, not through threats or promises or any of the crude mechanism that the regime used for lesser operatives. He had been recruited through evidence, through the accumulation of facts that had slowly, patiently, reshaped his understanding of the world. Magneto's people had shown him things, the human supremacist movements that had been waiting for a chance to rise again, even after mutant kind's victory. The concentration camps in the Antarctic territories where mutants who displayed insufficient loyalty to Magneto's regime were quietly held, a horror that Kurt had not known about, had not wanted to know about, had forced himself to confront because confronting it was the only way to understand what the world actually was. The thousands of small cruelties that Magneto's rule had prevented, the pogroms, the hate crimes, the systematic violence that humans were perfectly capable of inflicting on anyone they deemed other. And Kurt, who had spent his whole life believing in Charles Xavier's vision of coexistence, had looked at that evidence and felt something shift. Not a break, not a conversion, a recalibration, as if some internal compass that had always pointed toward Charles's dream had been slowly, quietly adjusted until it pointed somewhere else. He still believed in God, still prayed every night the way he had when he was a boy. The faith had not changed, could not change, because the faith was the foundation on which everything else was built. But the faith had learned new things, had incorporated new evidence, had come to understand that salvation was not just a spiritual concept but a practical one, and that practical salvation required something more than patience and good intentions. It required power. Charles had believed that power was unnecessary, that the gentle accumulation of understanding would be enough, that humans would eventually see mutants as they truly were and stop being afraid. Kurt had believed that too once, had believed it with the same uncomplicated faith he brought to God, but Charles was dead now, and the world had not become what Charles had believed it would become. The world had become what it had always been, a place where the strong survived and the weak were consumed, where fear was rational and understanding was not enough, where the only safety was the safety that could be enforced. Magneto had built that safety. Imperfect, brutal, built on the bones of principles Kurt had once held sacred but built. And as long as it stood, mutants would not be hunted, would not be feared, would not be exterminated the way humans had always tried to exterminate anything that was different enough to threaten them. Kurt had joined the remnant because it was the best way to serve Magneto's interests. He had risen through the organization's ranks because he was trusted. He was charming, empathetic, and genuinely believed in what he was doing, which was the most effective cover an agent could have. No one suspected the man who prayed before meals and wept at funerals of being a double agent. Least of all Ramai. Ramai trusted Kurt more than he trusted anyone in the Remnant except, perhaps, himself. They were partners in the truest sense, two half-men from broken backgrounds, building something that neither of them fully understood. Kurt had been with Ramai when the Remnant was 7 people and 70 and 700. He had helped design its structure, its protocols, its philosophy. He had also been reporting every significant development to Magneto's intelligence division for years. The thought did not trouble him. He had learned, in his years of double service, to separate his work from his feelings. He liked Ramai, genuinely liked him, as he liked most people who were not actively trying to harm mutant kind. Ramai was an idealist, and idealism was dangerous, and dangerous things needed to be managed. The Remnant was a symptom of that danger, a network of people who believed that another world was possible when the evidence clearly showed that it was not. Kurt's job was not to destroy the Remnant. His job was to control it, to ensure that its activities remained within parameters that did not threaten Magneto's rule. To watch and report, and occasionally intervene when the watching and reporting were not enough. Tonight, intervention was required. The Central Council meeting was scheduled for midnight. The attack on Magneto's primary energy hub, the coordinated strike that would disable power across the Genoshan capital for 72 hours, would be planned in detail. And Kurt would be there as he had been there for every meeting, as he would be there for every meeting until the Remnant was either brought under control or eliminated entirely. He finished his prayers, stood, brushed off his knees. The work was not done. The work was never done, but it was worth doing. That was what mattered. Chapter 11, The Campaign. The Central Council of the Remnant met in a safe house that had once been a church. Fitting, Ramai thought, that the ember should burn in a space that had once belonged to something else. The pews had been removed, replaced by chairs arranged in a circle, and the altar had been converted into a table where maps and documents were spread in the careful order of a military planning session. Kurt sat across from him. Their eyes met, the easy communion of people who had worked together for years, who knew each other's rhythms, who trusted each other in the way that only comes from shared risk and shared purpose. The intelligence is solid, Kurt said. His voice carried the quiet authority that had made him one of the Remnant's most effective recruiters, the voice of a man who had thought things through and arrived at conclusions that made sense. The hub's security is weaker than it was 6 months ago. Magneto's been diverting resources to the outer territories, the unrest in what used to be Japan, the pressure from Latveria. The center is less protected than it's been since he took power. Ramai studied the maps. The hub was a massive structure on the edge of the Genoshan capital, the facility that powered everything, from the lights in the streets to the systems that kept Magneto's palace running. Disable it, and the capital would be blind for 72 hours. Enough time to extract something from Magneto's archives, enough time to prove to the world that the regime was not invincible. And do intelligence onto archives? Ramai asked. The specific target, Kurt nodded to a woman across the circle, Myra, one of the Remnant's best intelligence analysts, who had spent months piecing together fragments of information about Magneto's personal collection. There are documents, Myra said. Correspondence from the early years before Charles's death, before the consolidation. Some of it appears to be personal letters, journals. Magneto kept them in a sub-level archive that even his closest advisors don't know exists. If we could extract those documents and release them, the world sees a different Magneto, Ramai finished. Not the Tyrant, the man. Exactly. It wouldn't destroy his regime, but it would humanize him in a way that changes the narrative. The resistance stops being a collection of radicals and becomes a movement with a cause, with a story. The room was quiet. Ramai looked around the circle, the faces of the people who had built this with him, who believed in what they were doing, who were willing to risk everything for an ember that might never catch. He looked at Kurt, at the trust in his eyes, at the faith that had sustained him through years of work that Kurt believed in, that Ramai believed in, that they both believed in even though they believed in it for different reasons. What's the risk? Ramai asked. Kurt leaned forward. The hub is heavily monitored. Even with the power out, Magneto's enforcers will respond within hours, maybe less. The extraction window is narrow. If we're caught, we know the risk. Then you understand what we're asking. Kurt's voice was steady, certain, the voice of a man who had thought this through and was asking others to think it through too. We're not talking about a raid or a sabotage operation. We're talking about a coordinated strike on the heart of Magneto's power. And if we fail, the Remnant loses more than a cell or two. We lose our center, our coordination, everything we've built over 5 years. Ramai was quiet for a long moment. The maps lay on the table, the lines and markers representing a world that had been built on patience and was now being asked to take a risk. The risk was calculated. That was the thing. The intelligence was good. The timing was right. And the reward, the documents, the narrative shift, the proof that Magneto could be reached was worth the cost. Not guaranteed, never guaranteed, but worth it. Okay, Ramai said. We do it. The room exhaled. Not relief, not yet, but the release of tension that came from a decision made, a path chosen. Kurt smiled. The smile was warm, genuine, the smile of a man who had been arguing for this and was glad the argument had been won. Then let's plan it, he said. Chapter 12, The Trap. Power went out at 2:47 in the morning. Ramai moved through the dark corridors of the Genoshan capital with the ease of a man who had spent years learning how to navigate spaces that were not meant to be navigated. The emergency lights were dead. The electromagnetic locks had failed. The city was blind, and Ramai was not. He had the route memorized, every turn, every checkpoint, every gap in the surveillance grid that the Remnant's intelligence had mapped over months of careful observation. The archive was 3 levels down, behind a door that responded to no code he had been given. But Ramai had spent 20 years learning that codes were suggestions and locks were puzzles, and puzzles existed to be solved. He reached the door, took out the device Myra had given him, a neural disruptor that would fool the lock's biometric scanner into thinking it was reading a recognized pattern. He pressed it against the panel, waited for the sequence to complete, felt the door release. The archive was smaller than he expected. A single room lined with shelves, each shelf holding a single file or a single box. The organization was obsessive, every item labeled, cataloged, placed with the precision of a mind that trusted nothing to chance. He found it on the 3rd shelf. An envelope older than the others, the paper yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front read, EL for after, Charles's handwriting. Ramai recognized it from a dozen mission briefings and personal notes, from the years when he had been an X-Man and Charles had been the closest thing to a father he had. He didn't open it. Not yet. He was too smart for that, too experienced, too cautious. The letter was the mission. Get it out, read it in a safe place, evaluate what it contained. The intelligence about Magneto's operation, the planned attack on the energy hub, the ongoing work of the Remnant, all of it could wait. He took the letter, sealed the archive, and began the journey back. He made it to the 3rd corridor before the lights came back on. Kurt stood in the doorway. He was not in the tactical gear of a Remnant operative. He was not in the black combat suit that would have marked him as one of the resistance fighters who had launched the attack on the energy hub. He was in the simple clothes of a citizen, the clothes of someone who had been walking home when the power went out, who had been surprised to find enforcers in the corridor, who was, in every visible way, just a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But his eyes were not the eyes of a surprised citizen. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Ramai, Kurt said quietly. Stop. Ramai stopped. His body became a statue, his hands still at his sides, because he understood immediately. He understood what Kurt was. He understood what Kurt had been. And he understood with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his entire life reading people, that the betrayal was not recent, that it had been there from the beginning or close enough to it. How long? Ramai asked. Since the beginning. The start of Remnant, before. Ramai closed his eyes. The pain was not where he expected it to be, not in his chest or his gut, but in his hands, in the fingers that had built this network card by card, contact by contact, trust by trust. Every handshake, every dead drop, every whispered plan, Kurt had been there for all of it, and Kurt had been telling Magneto about all of it. They knew everything, Ramai said, not a question. Everything important. The energy hub attack, the whole operation, canceled before it started. The enforcers were already in position when the power went out. Your cells at the hub, they're being processed now, all of them. Ramai opened his eyes. He was still holding the letter, Charles's letter. He looked at it, then at Kurt. You don't know what's in here. No, but you're gonna stop me from finding out. I'm going to take it from you and destroy it. Eric's orders. Ramai looked at Kurt for a long time. The corridor was bright now, emergency lights, the hum of restored power, enforcers in the distance that would arrive in minutes. The red light on Kurt's face made him look like the thing he had always secretly been, a devil wearing the mask of an angel. You believe in him, Ramai said. It was not an accusation, it was a recognition. I believe in what he built. That ain't the same thing. It is for me. Ramai held the letter out, not to Kurt, but for Kurt to take. He didn't fight, he didn't run. He just extended his hand and waited. Kurt took the letter. Ramai, Kurt said, and his voice broke on the name. I didn't want it to be you. I know. I need you to understand. I don't need to understand anything. Ramai's voice was steady, tired, final. You made your choice. You made it a long time ago. Now you live with it, same as I will. Kurt looked at the letter in his hand, then at Ramai, then at the letter again. Something happened in that moment, some flicker of the old Kurt, the one who had believed in Charles and the X-Men and the dream of a world where people like him didn't have to hide. It passed across his face like a shadow, there and gone, and then it was replaced by something harder. The mask went back on. The faith returned. "The enforcers will be here in 5 minutes," Kurt said. "You should leave." "I know." Kurt turned and walked away. Ramai listened to his footsteps fade until the corridor was silent. Then Ramai reached into his coat and pulled out the real letter, the one he had palmed before handing over the fake. Charles's handwriting, same as before, identical envelope. He had swapped them in the half-second Kurt was looking at his face instead of his hands. Thieves never forget. Ramai tucked the real letter against his chest and disappeared into the dark. Chapter 13. The Reading. The safe house was in ruins. Ramai had moved through 3 locations before finding one that was still standing, but barely, the walls thin and the neighbors suspicious, the kind of place that Magneto's enforcers would find eventually if he stayed too long. He didn't plan to stay too long. He planned to read the letter, evaluate what it contained, and make a decision about what came next. The letter was 4 pages long. It was written in Charles's hand, precise, controlled, the handwriting of a man who had spent his life organizing thoughts into words and words into movements. But the content was not what Ramai expected. Charles had not written a manifesto. He had not written a confession or a condemnation. He had written a conversation, the conversation he wished he could have had with Eric, the conversation they had never managed to have in life because every time they came close to it, something pulled them apart. Hatred, pride, fear, history, love. And in this letter, Charles had finally said the thing he had never said. "Eric, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if you're reading this, some part of you wants to know what I would have said if I could. So let me say it. You were right. Not about everything. Not about the methods, not about the cruelty, not about the things you were willing to do that I never was. But you were right about the fundamental truth. Humanity will hurt us. They will always hurt us. It is not in their nature to accept what they do not understand, and they will never understand us. I believed otherwise. I built my life's work on the belief that understanding was possible, that if we were good enough, patient enough, noble enough, we could teach humanity to accept us. And I was wrong. Not because the goal was wrong, but because I asked you to wait for it. I asked our children to wait for it. I asked mutants to be patient with the very species that had spent millennia finding new ways to hate the different. That was unfair of me. I knew it was unfair, and I did it anyway because I could not face the alternative. The alternative was to become like them, to fight fear with fear, to meet hatred with hatred, to say that if they would not accept us, then we would make them accept us. And I could not do that. Not because it was wrong, perhaps it was the only honest answer, but because I could not lose myself. My belief in the better was all I had. But you, Eric, you were willing to lose yourself. You were willing to pay the price I was not. And I have spent years hating you for that willingness when perhaps I should have been grateful. Grateful because you were right about what would happen if we did not fight, and angry because you were right about what we would become if we did. There is no clean answer. There never was. Only the answer we can live with and the one we cannot. I could not live with yours. You cannot live with mine. And so we are here, on opposite sides of a war that neither of us wanted and both of us caused. I forgive you, Eric, for all of it. For the years of violence and the millions of lives disrupted, and the dream we shared that you turned into something I cannot follow. I forgive you because holding on to the anger is the last thing I want to do before I die. And I ask you, not as a friend, not as a brother, but as someone who knew you before either of us knew what we would become, to consider. When you have won everything you wanted to win, when there is nothing left to fight and no one left to fear, what will you do with the peace you forced into existence? Will you be the tyrant I always worried you would be? Or will you be the protector you always claimed to want to be? The difference is not in the power. It is in the humility. And I do not know, Eric, if you are capable of that. I hope you are. Yours, in a brotherhood that death cannot break, Charles. Ramai read the letter 3 times. The first time, he read it as a document, as information, as intelligence, as the kind of thing that could be used or weaponized or shared with the Remnant's leadership to advance whatever agenda needed advancing. Charles Xavier, the founder of the X-Men, the man who had believed in coexistence with a fervor that bordered on faith, had written a letter admitting that his enemy was right. The letter was dynamite. The letter was leverage. The letter was everything the Remnant needed to understand the war they were fighting and the man they were fighting against. The second time, he read it as a story, as the narrative of 2 men who had loved each other in their way and had spent 60 years trying to destroy each other because they could not find any other language for what they felt. Charles's words were not just admissions, they were grief. They were the grief of a man who had spent his life believing in something and who had discovered, too late, that the belief had been built on a foundation of sand. He had known at the end, had known and had been unable to do anything except write a letter that would never be read and a confession that would never be heard. The third time, Ramai read it as himself. He thought about Kurt, not the betrayal, not the years of lying, but the faith behind it. Kurt had believed, genuinely believed that Magneto's world was the only thing protecting mutants from the human nature that Charles had finally admitted was unchangeable. Kurt had looked at the evidence and concluded that the remnant was a symptom of a disease that could not be cured, that the ember would never catch, that the patience would never pay off, that the only realistic option was to accept the world as it was and work within it rather than against it. Was Kurt wrong? Ramai didn't know. That was the thing he could not get past, the thing that made the letter more devastating than any weapon could have been. Charles had spent his whole life believing that humans could learn, could change, could eventually accept mutants as peers rather than threats. He had built a school on that belief. He had built an army on that belief. He had died, had been killed defending that belief. And in the end, he had admitted that it was wrong, not completely, not in every detail, but in the fundamental truth that had driven both him and Magneto for 60 years. Humanity would not change. Fear was rational. The only safety was the safety that could be enforced. Ramai sat in the safe house with the letter in his hands, and the weight of that admission pressing down on him. He had built the remnant on a different belief, on the idea that patience could succeed where force had failed, that the ember would catch eventually, that the story of freedom would spread through example rather than through revolution. He had believed in that idea with the same uncomplicated faith that Charles had once brought to coexistence. But Charles had believed too, had believed and been wrong. What if Ramai was wrong too? Chapter 14. The Burning. Ramai burned the letter. He did it at dawn in the courtyard of the safe house with a lighter that he had carried for years without ever using. The paper caught slowly, the old paper, the kind that burned hot and fast once it started, and within seconds the letter was gone, reduced to ash and smoke and the particular smell of words that were never meant to be read by anyone except their intended recipient. Charles had left the letter for Eric, not for the remnant, not for the resistance, not for a half-breed thief who had stolen it from a traitor's hands and read it in the dark. Charles had left it for Eric, for the man who had killed him, for the man who had built a world on the foundation of Charles's admission, for the man who would never know what Charles had finally understood in the years before his death. Ramai had read it. That was enough. The rest was between the dead man and the living one. He sat in the courtyard for a long time after the letter was gone. The sun rose slowly, the same sun that had risen over Genosha on the day Charles died, over the arena on the night Johnny burned, over every moment of this long, impossible war that had consumed everything it touched and would continue consuming until there was nothing left. The remnant was broken. Not destroyed, the network was too resilient for that, too distributed, too built on the patient accumulation of trust to be wiped out by a single betrayal. But broken. The cells that had launched the attack on the energy hub were gone, captured, or killed, their members processed by enforcers who had been waiting for them. The center of coordination was compromised. The leaders who had gathered in the safe house in Berlin were either dead or in hiding. Kurt was still out there, still serving Magneto, still believing with the same uncomplicated faith that had driven him to betray everything he had built with Ramai that he was doing the right thing. And Magneto had won. Again. As he had always won, as he would always win, because the game was rigged in his favor, and the only way to change the rules was to change the player, and no one could change Magneto. Or could they? Ramai thought about Charles's question, the question that had been sitting at the center of the letter, unspoken but present, the thing Charles had wanted Eric to consider before he died. When you have won everything you wanted to win, when there is nothing left to fight and no one left to fear, what will you do with the peace you forced into existence? Magneto had won. The world was his. The peace was established. And the question remained, the question that Charles had asked, and that no one would ever answer because the only person who could answer it was the person the question was meant for. Would Magneto be the protector or the tyrant? The difference, Charles had written, was not in the power. It was in the humility. And Charles had doubted even at the end, even in the letter where he admitted that Eric was right, whether Eric was capable of that. Ramai didn't know either. He had known Magneto for years, had fought beside him, against him, beside him again. He had seen the man underneath the helmet, the survivor underneath the tyrant. He knew that Eric Laneshare was not a monster. He knew that the trauma was real, the love was real, the pain was real. He knew that the boy from Auschwitz had become the most powerful mutant on Earth not because he wanted to hurt people, but because he could not bear to let people be hurt the way he had been hurt. But he also knew what Magneto had done. The wars, the violence, the thousands of lives disrupted and destroyed in the name of a peace that could only be maintained through force. The choice to kill Charles, to silence the only voice that might have made him question himself, because silence was easier than doubt and certainty was safer than doubt, and doubt was the enemy of everything Magneto had built. Was Eric capable of humility? Ramai didn't know. But he knew, suddenly, clearly, with the certainty that came from burning a letter that was never meant to be burned, that the answer was the only thing that mattered. The ember would catch eventually. The remnant would rebuild as it always did from the ashes of every disaster. The story would spread as it always did through the patient accumulation of people who remembered that another way was possible. And when it did, when the moment came and the fire caught and the world finally began to change, the question would not be whether Magneto was strong enough to hold his empire together. The question would be whether Eric Laneshire was wise enough to let it go. Ramai stood, brushed off his coat, walked out of the courtyard and into the city that belonged to Magneto. The ember was still burning. It would catch eventually. It always did.